It was a moment no one would ever forget. No one could believe this man was sprinting straight through the lines of German soldiers defending the Belgian town of Foy in January of 1945, least of all the Germans themselves. In fact, they nearly forgot to shoot. It was only when the Germans took the time to fire an 88mm artillery piece directly at him that he considered himself slightly impressed. At least the Germans were finally trying. However, not even the big guns could take down American Lieutenant Ronald Speirs. His reputation was already notorious among the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne. Since the blood-soaked days following D-Day, Speirs had become a myth and a nightmare. Some stories painted him as the perfect combat leader, fearless, decisive, and utterly committed to the mission. Other accounts would soon describe something much darker. Take no prisoners. Ronald Charles Speirs was born in 1920 in Edinburgh, Scotland, and by the time he was 4, he and his family had crossed the Atlantic to settle in Boston. The young Speirs wasn't one for conventional paths. He attended military training in high school, earning a commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Army. When the U.S. entered World War II, Speirs volunteered for the paratroopers. This brought him to the 506th Parachute Infantry of the 101st Airborne Division, where he endured brutal training at Camp Toccoa, Georgia. By 1943, the division was sent to England to prepare for the invasion of Normandy. After jumping into the dark skies of D-Day, he linked up with his men and quickly took charge of a small group, storming Brickhour Manor. They captured a German howitzer and moved on. The night was spent repositioning, waiting for the fight to heat up. By dawn on June 7th, Speirs' platoon was ready to move out again. But before that, Speirs faced a decision that would cement his reputation and stoke rumors that persist to this day. The morning grew tense. Another small group of surrendering Germans appeared, and once again, Speirs' hand was allegedly forced. As the dust settled, a commotion erupted in his own ranks. A sergeant, drunk and belligerent, began shouting about charging forward, ignoring the order to hold his position. Speirs confronted him, but the sergeant refused to back down. With a steady voice, Speirs ordered the man to get back to the rear. But the sergeant, fueled by alcohol and anger, reached for his rifle. Speirs had no choice. The sergeant leveled his weapon, and Speirs shot him in self-defense. The entire platoon witnessed the event in stunned silence. Speirs immediately reported the incident to Captain Jerry Gross, who deemed it justified. The legend of Speirs had begun. Cold, fearless, and brutally decisive. His men feared him, admired him, and trusted him with their lives. To the smoldering city. As the beaches of Normandy began to cool, the 101st Airborne, still haunted by the ghosts of D-Day, prepared to push deeper into the heart of France. Just before dawn on June 11, 1944, Ronald Speirs stirred in the half-light beside the Douve River. Speirs didn't feel rested. None of his platoon did. 6 days of combat had worn them thin. They jumped into Normandy with only K rations, and now they waited, bone-tired and strung tight. Speirs later recalled, quote, "The platoon had only one full night of sleep. The men were physically and mentally affected." French resistance fighters showed up at command posts, their fingers tight around stolen Mausers, dropping off the latest intel. War correspondents sniffed around for stories. Some men joked that with all the captured horses corralled by the division, the Airborne might soon become cavalry. But no one laughed at the graves registration tents. The fallen were wrapped in plain bags. Clerks combed through the pockets of boys who wouldn't make it home. Inside the camp perimeter, some men were already cracking. The tremors, the 1,000-yard stares, the silence. Speirs had seen it before. He said nothing. Later that day, Speirs moved northwest of Carentan, scanning the town with his field glasses. Below, the place was scorched and smoking. Civilians scrambled through the rubble, hauling water buckets to overwhelmed fire crews. But behind that chaos, something else stirred. Fallschirmjäger and SS Panzergrenadiers tightening the noose. The Germans defending Carentan weren't Green Volkssturm. These were veterans from Italy in the Eastern Front, Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6 and elements of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division. The plan was straightforward on paper. Take Carentan and link up the Omaha and Utah beachheads. The order came directly from Eisenhower. The 101st Airborne would hit it from the north, while 5th Corps attacked from Isigny. But the marshes were flooded. Narrow causeways were covered by machine gun fire. German positions were dug in and overlapping. Speirs reported, quote, "Neither battalion was able to advance, taking very heavy casualties because of the strong enemy resistance and good defensive positions. The flooded fields to either flank made it impossible to flank the defenders." Their objective: approach from the west of Carentan and seize the southern high ground, Hill 30. The terrain was nearly impassable. Speirs knew the hill would be worse than expected. He reviewed the enemy with cold precision, stating that they, quote, "were well aware of the German paratroopers' fighting capabilities because the Germans had defended Saint-Côme-du-Mont and VRV in the early fighting to the north. They attacked strongly when ordered and were armed with a high percentage of automatic weapons." Speirs didn't talk about courage. He didn't talk about fear. He simply led, and Hill 30 was waiting. The price of liberation. Fallschirmjäger troops, German paratroopers, stood apart from ordinary Wehrmacht units. Their camouflage schmucks and squat helmets gave them a distinctive silhouette on the battlefield, easily spotted by Speirs and his men. Speirs would later write, quote, "Their morale seemed good. This was possibly because fighting the Americans was preferable to fighting both Russians and cold weather." That didn't put Speirs at ease, and he was just as concerned with the Wehrmacht's tanks. Only days earlier, outside Saint-Côme-du-Mont, Speirs' platoon froze as a German armored car emerged, guns blazing. One GI dropped instantly. Before they could react, the vehicle peeled off toward Carentan. Days later, spotting enemy armor near the town, Speirs felt the dread return. German armor was confirmed in the area. In comparison, his own platoon's firepower was anemic. He had one light machine gun. Regardless, Speirs stated that, quote, "Riflemen were more valuable during the constant attacking in which we'd been engaged. Our light machine guns during the Normandy campaign were not provided with the bipod, but only a tripod, which was not satisfactory while attacking in hedgerow country." Worse than the treacherous terrain or the worn-out gear was the manpower. His force had dwindled to just 14 men, a shadow of a typical 40-strong platoon. Finally, after midnight, the 2nd Battalion moved on. Dog Company trailed at the rear, with men assigned carts and a single horse per company to haul ammunition. Lacking motorized transport, they had no choice. But it wasn't all bad. Horses were quieter, reducing the risk of alerting the enemy. Progress was slow. Headquarters Company bogged down almost immediately under the weight of mortars, machine guns, and bazookas. Fires burned in Carentan ahead, an orange glow rippling across flooded fields. Naval guns hammered the town ahead of their approach. The battalion moved off-road near a battered farmhouse. Speirs and his men slung their weapons and began hauling the heavy gear by hand. Broken fences, churned earth, and scattered debris filled the yards. Hours passed. The battalion staggered forward, blind and exhausted. Units lost contact with those ahead. Some men nodded off, standing up. Officers had to shake them awake. Enemy fire crackled in the distance, but resistance was scattered. At last, 3 hours after leaving camp, 1st Battalion reached Hill 30. The Germans had merely allowed them in, possibly laying a trap. Speirs deployed his men along the Boat Road and scanned the countryside. Most could barely stay awake. The fatigue had consequences. In the dim light, a lone figure moved toward their line. No challenge, no signal. The trigger snapped. The man dropped. When they checked the body, horror set in. It was a 1st Battalion soldier, one of their own. It was a needless friendly fire casualty. At 2:30 a.m., The battalion commanders met under a rubber raincoat to hide their flashlights from the Germans. There, beneath the coat, Speirs got his orders. The attack would begin at 6 a.m. They would drive straight into Carentan, house by house, street by street. And Speirs was ready. Fires at the edge of town. Just before sunrise on June 12th, the battlefield erupted. At approximately 4 a.m., leaders of the 506th were stunned to discover their regimental command post had, under the cover of night, mistakenly advanced well beyond its own front line. German machine gunners, lying in wait, quickly identified the exposed position and opened fire. Tracers ripped through the dark as headquarters personnel dove for cover. A full company was immediately dispatched to put the command post out of the attack zone. The rescue effort unfolded under fire, with paratroopers exchanging bursts of carbine fire as they pushed toward the pinned HQ. With the element of surprise fading and time critical, 2nd Battalion committed to a direct thrust into Carentan. Rather than deploying cautiously through the hedgerows, the battalion moved straight down the main highway in a column of companies, Fox in the lead, followed by Easy and Dog. Fox Company hit the outskirts first. German defenders let them come within range, then unleashed mortars and automatic fire. Troopers sprinted for cover in ditches and hollows. Easy Company followed into the maelstrom and immediately came under heavy machine gun and 88mm artillery fire. Speirs watched the field ahead turn into a culling ground. Artillery had pinned them down for hours. Then they ran. Meanwhile, resistance stiffened at the town's edge. A German machine gun in a cluster of houses pinned down the column. Speirs' men bounded into a neighboring building, scrambled upstairs, and fired a rifle grenade into the enemy's position. The explosion silenced it. Moments later, a .30 caliber machine gun was set up on the same floor and raked the street below. German infantry fleeing the scene were gunned down in waves. By 8:30 a.m., the worst was over. D Company pushed into Carentan as the last firefight sputtered out. The streets were cratered, buildings reduced to rubble, whole blocks burning. Carentan had fallen, but Ronald Speirs and the 506th weren't done. Orders came within hours. Move southwest, seize Bopt. His platoon pushed west through heat and humidity, clearing a battered suburb. They expected resistance, maybe worse, after reports of German strength nearby, but found only shattered homes and shaken civilians. Inside one wrecked house, Speirs encountered an elderly Frenchman, bruised from the bombardment. Speirs ordered him toward an aid station without delay. The man nodded, dazed. A reporter nearby had captured it plainly, quote, "The French have come through much suffering, and they know that often our shells and bombs have done it, but they say, this is the price we pay for liberation." At dusk, Speirs' senior, Lieutenant Joseph McMillan, received the order to fall back to battalion headquarters under cover of darkness. He and Speirs moved the company cautiously down a dirt road flanked by high hedgerows, the path barely wide enough for 2 men abreast. Visibility was poor, but they reached the main line without contact. Most of the men collapsed, finally allowed a few hours rest. But McMillan and Speirs stayed alert, checking their sector one last time. Near the orchard, Speirs caught movement. He waved, then stopped cold. The last 2 figures turned. German helmets. McMillan took off instantly to give warning, sprinting across open fields and brush toward the stone house that housed the colonel's HQ. Gunfire cracked behind him. He hadn't made it in time. At headquarters, Easy Company was already engaging the enemy. Just then, 6 light tanks arrived. The tank crew let loose on the orchard with their machine guns. Flames lit the tree line. The German incursion had been blunted, but the line remained fragile. This wouldn't be the last push. The Battle of Bloody Gulch. Before first light on June 13th, Speirs' 2nd platoon assembled for a direct assault on a farmstead below the Carentan rail line. The target was a stone-walled compound situated on a slight downslope, flanked by hedgerows and likely occupied by entrenched Germans. Speirs coordinated the advance with the battalion mortar section. at precisely 4 a.m., the 81mm tubes opened up. A torrent of high-explosive shells rained onto the farmhouse, the concussion breaking roof tiles and touching off an internal blaze. As the roof caved in and smoke poured skyward, Speirs gave the signal. His men moved down the slope in a skirmish line, rifles low, checking their sectors. They were 75 yards from the wall when everything changed. Incoming shells shrieked from the west. German mortars and artillery, 81 and 105mm, hammered the hillside behind them. The rear elements were caught in the open. One rifleman was hit and left behind, screaming in pain. The rest surged forward, leaping the waist-high stone wall into the smoldering courtyard. Inside, the situation deteriorated fast. The farmhouse burned hot, pushing thick black smoke into the yard and stinging the men's eyes. Then machine gun bursts ripped out from behind them. Germans had moved up the rear hedgerow, trying to cut them off. Speirs turned and saw enemy silhouettes sprinting along the tree line, advancing fast. He shouted to the bar team. The Browning cracked and barked, 20-round magazines snapping empty in seconds. Brass scattered across the stones as enemy cries cut through the smoke. Speirs' riflemen then opened up with aimed fire, the courtyard a tangle of muzzle flashes and shouted commands. One man's M1 heated so badly he had to drop it, the stock slick with grease and sweat. Still, they held the rear. Then the grenades came. From the western hedgerow, the first of the German Eierhandgranaten sailed into the enclosure. Small, compact, and lethal, these grenades bounced before exploding, showering shrapnel in every direction. The first wave detonated near the northern wall, throwing hot metal across the squad. One fragment tore into Speirs' right temple, another pierced his knee. He staggered back, half blinded, the high-pitched whine of the blast drowning out everything else. One private, John Dilsey, took a grenade to the chest. It bounced off him and detonated beside his hip, leaving him wounded on the floor. Then came the assault. Fallschirmjäger charged from the tree line just 25 yards out. They advanced in open formation, firing as they came. Speirs rallied his riflemen. From behind the stone wall, the Americans opened fire in a synchronized volley. The bar fired in long bursts, and every German body dropped before anyone reached the wall. The charge failed. Still, the second platoon was in serious danger. The house was fully engulfed in flames. Ammunition was now almost gone. Speirs looked over the wall. Dog and Fox companies were retreating. They were alone. Speirs related the danger, quote, "There was no protection against grenades in the courtyard, and the burning house was throwing out a suffocating heat and smoke." Speirs, now bleeding and staggering, scanned for an exit. In the corner of the yard, he spotted a shallow drainage ditch that extended northeast toward friendly lines. He shouted over the madness, quote, "Second platoon, on me," and made for the ditch. Men followed in staggered twos and threes, crawling and sprinting. One tried to lift Private Dilsey, but was told to leave him, heeding the grim words of a fellow fleeing GI, quote, "There's nothing we can do." No one wanted to abandon him, but the window to escape was closing. They left the private behind. Speirs was the last man into the ditch. He could hear rounds snapping overhead and the groans of the wounded drifting up from the courtyard. The platoon then crawled and slid through muck and reeds, 300 yards back toward the regimental line. They emerged coated in mud, bleeding, exhausted, but alive. Speirs limped toward the command post, his knee pulsing with pain, his face caked with brown and red. The battle wasn't over, but the second platoon had survived Bloody Gulch, for now. Haunting decisions. Speirs and his men slogged through the muddy gully, back to their lines, boots slipping in the wet soil, uniforms soaked, weapons clutched tightly. When they finally reached their foxholes, they collapsed inside, drained and battered. But as Speirs scanned the field, he realized the situation was crumbling. F Company had pulled back, again, this time to high ground 100 yards behind. No orders, no warning. To Speirs, it was a disaster. The retreat had shattered the left flank, leaving a gaping hole in the battalion's perimeter. But as he advanced, he realized F Company had reason. A German tank formation had been charging straight toward them. Now, D Company was scrambling to fill the gap. Inside the lines, Speirs found his men shaken, crouching low, clinging to dirt for cover, their eyes wide with the knowledge that the worst was still coming. Describing his men that day, he proudly recalled they were, quote, frightened, but not panic-stricken. The Germans still held the hedgerows on the flanks. Suppressive fire had to be maintained, or the whole line could unravel. Speirs moved through the trenches, shouting and kicking the men back into action, forcing rifles up, re-establishing sectors of fire. At 2 p.m., the ground began to rumble under the treads of 60 vehicles. Combat Command A of the 2nd Armored Division arrived in force. Sherman tanks, M5 lights, and self-propelled 105s. Speirs described it as, quote, a beautiful sight to the battered 2nd Battalion. The tanks were firing as they advanced and doing a wonderful job. The tanks blew apart hedgerows and woodlots with high-explosive shells. German infantry fell back in disarray. The corridor between Utah and Omaha beaches remained open. Speirs' platoon was pulled back into Carentan and placed in reserve. Only 50 men in Dog Company remained fit for combat. Still, Speirs noted the mental resilience of his men, saying, quote, the majority of the men fought bravely, even though the companies were forced to yield ground. The battalion had done its part in defending Carentan, and the men and officers were proud of their job. That night, news reached them of Private John Dielsey. He'd been discovered by a German paratrooper. One of them bayoneted the wounded American and left him for the vultures. But the private didn't perish. He crawled through the American lines, bleeding, half-conscious. Medics found him and rushed him to an aid station. Ronald Speirs never forgot Private Dielsey's suffering. The tough decision to abandon him would haunt Speirs for the rest of his life. Speirs served in the Korean War, participating in Operation Tomahawk in March 1951. After Korea, he served as a liaison officer in East Germany. His final military assignment was as a plans officer at the Pentagon, retiring in 1964 as a lieutenant colonel. Throughout his career, Speirs received numerous awards, including the Silver Star, Legion of Merit, Bronze Star, and Purple Heart. His legendary role in World War II, particularly in the battles of Carentan and Bloody Gulch, was brought to the screen in the 2001 series Band of Brothers.